They were never meant for you to hear this. In the winter of 1938, as the mountains of Asturias whispered beneath the cold shadow of war, a secret thrived where no outsiders dared to tread. You are about to glimpse the story of three sisters, bound by blood and obsession, whose lives were shaped by a man who believed purity justified any act, even the unimaginable. From the first glance, their home seemed ordinary, a stone farmhouse clinging to the slope of a forgotten valley. But inside, time itself had fractured. The air smelled of candle wax and damp wood, of secrets so tightly held that even the wind seemed afraid to disturb them. The eldest sister, Elena, stood by the hearth, eyes piercing and calculating, a reflection of the chilling authority that had guided her entire upbringing. Subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because history's shadows reach everywhere. Her younger sisters, Magdalena and Esperanza, moved like echoes of one another, indistinct yet inextricably tied to the same oppressive rhythm. Their father, Don Aurelio Calderón, had long ago convinced them that their blood was sacred, their purpose divine. This was no exaggeration. Generations of meticulously preserved lineage had been documented in yellowed tomes, the pages etched with names that formed a chain of obsession. Outside the valley, the world teetered on the brink of chaos, but here rules of society had been replaced by something darker, more precise. A doctrine of preservation, administered with quiet cruelty. The sisters were to marry a single man, a cousin, or so they believed, because the continuation of their lineage demanded it. Yet there was more, far beyond the simplicity of a father's plan. The man they would marry, Rodrigo Calderón, carried within him a truth buried so deep that its revelation would unmake the world they knew. Concealed documents, falsified identities, and whispered manipulations had constructed a reality so meticulous, even the sisters themselves could not grasp its full horror. In this frozen corner of Asturias, history bent towards secrecy. Every whispered instruction, every carefully orchestrated arrangement, was designed to ensure that nothing, no outsiders, no authorities, not even their own curiosity, would disrupt the legacy Aurelio sought to enforce. Even as winter deepened and the mountains pressed close, the sisters moved through their home like instruments of a plan older than themselves. Elena's gaze never left the genealogical charts. Magdalena's hands trembled at the edges of forbidden knowledge. Esperanza alone felt a shiver of apprehension that she could not yet name. And you, listening now, are crossing the threshold of that forbidden space, witnessing a lineage engineered in shadow, a family whose devotion to purity would lead to consequences beyond comprehension. This is the story buried beneath centuries of silence, the tale of the Calderón sisters and the secret that was never meant to reach your ears. The valley itself seemed to conspire with secrecy. Winds howled down jagged cliffs, carrying tales of isolation that no traveler could fully comprehend. The stone walls of the Calderón farmhouse, thick and unyielding, enclosed a world where every shadow had meaning, where every creaking floorboard was a witness to a ritual older than memory. Elena, eldest and most compliant, moved through this darkness with a kind of deliberate awareness that unsettled even her sisters. She cataloged every name, every birth date, every nuance of Rodrigo's presence, as if the very air contained lessons she could not afford to ignore. Magdalena followed, hesitant but attentive, her mind fluttering between doubt and obedience, caught in the web of rules and unspoken threats that had defined her upbringing. Esperanza, youngest, sensed the imbalance before any words confirmed it. The calculations, the rotations, the unseen hierarchy orchestrated by their father. She felt the weight of inevitability pressing against her chest, a suffocating certainty that nothing in this valley would ever be ordinary again. Rodrigo's arrival had been understated, almost ghostly. He came not as a man but as an instrument, a vessel for a purpose that even he did not entirely understand. His eyes held the same gray hue that marked the Calderón lineage, a detail that should have seemed innocuous, yet in the context of the valley's obsessive attention to purity, it was a signal of something far more disturbing. He moved between the sisters according to a schedule dictated by Aurelio, his presence a constant reminder that the rules of family, of love, and of morality had been rewritten here. At 3 seconds past the hour, you must remember your gaze is now part of this exposure, your curiosity a thread linking you to the forbidden. The rotations, the whispered instructions, the careful concealment of pregnancies. All of it was a design to concentrate bloodlines beyond any natural order, to manipulate inheritance with a precision that defied conscience. Even the furniture of the farmhouse seemed to carry history's weight. The heavy wooden tables, the carved chests, the cold iron candle holders, all preserved relics of the Calderón obsession, created a labyrinth of inheritance and authority. Every object was catalogued, labeled, positioned to enforce a memory of control. And within this orchestrated environment, the sisters became both guardians and prisoners of a secret so profound that it could erase the boundaries between devotion and horror. Esperanza watched as Alina memorized charts, as Magdalena quivered at the edges of forbidden knowledge, and she understood that their lives had been consumed by something invisible yet absolute, the imperative to preserve a bloodline that was no longer merely human, but an idea incarnate. Outside, winter pressed on the valley with silent insistence, cutting them off from any intervention, any perspective beyond the confines of their engineered world. And you, here, are seeing it too. You are stepping into the shadows where history hides its most disturbing truths. The story of the Calderón Sisters is not one of chance or accident. It is an edifice of obsession, a living experiment in control, manipulation, and the deliberate erasure of what the outside world might call morality. Every step you take into this story pulls you deeper, where the distinction between duty and atrocity dissolves into something unbearably precise. And yet, you cannot look away. By the end of that first winter, the house had become a theater of silent terror. Every glance, every whispered instruction, carried weight beyond comprehension. Rodrigo moved like a shadow among the sisters, his presence tolerated, anticipated, yet never questioned aloud. Alina took her place with meticulous obedience, her mind absorbing genealogical patterns as if they were scripture. Magdalena, torn between instinct and indoctrination, followed the motions, her heart heavy with unspoken doubt. Esperanza alone began to notice the fractures forming in their collective consciousness, the subtle ways Aurelio's control bent thought and feeling, molding them into instruments of his sacred mission. Each night, the three sisters lay in separate rooms, yet their lives were inseparable in ways that defied natural law. They were bound by obligation, by fear, and by a doctrine that blurred the line between family and function. Aurelio's method was relentless. He had not only rewritten the rules of kinship, but had instilled in his daughters an unwavering sense of duty. The doctrine of pure blood became a lens through which they interpreted every action, every word. Curiosity was punished, hesitation forbidden. Any lapse could unravel decades of meticulous calculation. At 3 seconds past the hour, take note your understanding of morality, like theirs, is about to be challenged. The rotations were more than schedule. They were ritual, repetition, a constant reinforcement of obedience and complicity. Each sister learned, consciously or not, that participation was survival. Resistance invited isolation, shame, and a terror that was woven into the walls themselves. Rodrigo, for his part, adapted quickly to the cadence of the household. His silence was not empty, it contained authority, knowledge, and complicity. He was a man who seemed to understand, at some instinctive level, the boundaries he must not cross, and yet he carried secrets of his own. The truth of his lineage, buried beneath layers of deceit, hovered in the background like a storm ready to break. Every interaction he had with Alina, Magdalena, or Esperanza reinforced the delicate machinery of the Bloodline project. Aurelio's instructions had trained them to treat him not merely as husband or cousin, but as a node in the network of their shared destiny, a living embodiment of genetic obsession. By candlelight, the sisters pored over family charts that mapped ancestry with obsessive precision. The charts became talismans of control, each line and name a subtle instrument of psychological conditioning. Children of past generations were reduced to patterns and probabilities, their humanity stripped away to reveal only the calculus of inheritance. Esperanza began to record in secret, documenting every subtle change in behavior, every enforced obedience, every whispered conversation. She understood the stakes. Knowledge might be the only leverage against the machinery of devotion and horror. Outside, winter's silence pressed in, sealing the house off from intrusion, from intervention. Inside, the sisters moved in measured patterns, their minds tethered to a design older than themselves. And you, listening now, are stepping into that design. You are witnessing a lineage manipulated with surgical precision, a family transformed into living instruments of obsession. The deeper you descend, the more you see purity, control, and devotion have been weaponized, and the consequences ripple outward in ways the world was never meant to know. Rodrigo's arrival was only the beginning. Beneath his calm demeanor and hollowed eyes lay a truth so tightly buried it had eluded even the sisters' awareness. Every gesture, every look, carried the weight of hidden knowledge Aurelio had meticulously obscured for decades. At 3 seconds past this moment, pay attention. You are now entering the threshold of revelation, where innocence and manipulation merge into a singular horror. The man they had accepted as a cousin, as a husband, was not what he seemed. He was far closer, far more entangled in the Calderón bloodline than even Aurelio's daughters could imagine. The letters discovered in later years would reveal the unimaginable. Rodrigo was, in fact, Aurelio's own son, born of a secret union that had been erased from history. Every instruction, every rotation of wives, every whisper in the dark had been calculated to conceal this truth while amplifying the sisters' obedience. Alina, the eldest, carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she understood the rules. She cataloged genealogical charts, memorized names, and followed rotations with precise devotion. But Rodrigo's presence unsettled even her. He moved with an awareness that betrayed more than mere knowledge of the schedule. He knew instinctively the significance of each chart, each birth date, each anomaly in the bloodline. His role was not merely as husband or cousin, but as the living continuation of Aurelio's design, a carefully concealed instrument in a generational experiment. Magdalena's hesitations grew sharper in winter's shadow. She began to notice the subtle duplicity, the inconsistencies in Aurelio's stories, the unnatural precision with which Rodrigo moved through their lives. Questions that might have been asked aloud were instead swallowed, repressed by fear and indoctrination. The house became a pressure cooker of obedience and suspicion, every creaking floorboard and flickering candle casting shadows heavy with implication. Esperanza alone sensed the depth of deception. She observed the rotations, the careful obscuring of pregnancies, the unnatural rhythm of family life, and felt the first shiver of understanding. The system was more than a breeding plan. It was a framework of control, designed to erase self-determination and implant loyalty to an idea of purity. She began to record, secretly, every interaction, every whispered command, every deliberate omission. Her notes would later serve as testimony to an atrocity disguised as devotion, a meticulous record of abuse, manipulation, and forbidden knowledge that no one outside the valley could have imagined. Even the walls seemed to listen. Every corner, every shadow, every candle lit hallway held memory and intent. And now, you, the observer, are tied to this history. You are crossing into forbidden ground, where the natural laws of morality, family, and love have been rewritten by obsession. The Calderón sisters exist here not as victims alone, but as participants in a design that defies comprehension. Step carefully. The further you descend, the more you realize that secrecy is a weapon and knowledge is both the key and the burden. Winter gave way to early spring, and with it came the first signs that Aurelio's design was beginning to bear fruit. Alina, obedient and precise, became pregnant first, her body bending to the cycles dictated by her father's unyielding calculations. The other sisters, Magdalena and Esperanza, watched, aware yet constrained, as their lives twisted around a rhythm they had neither chosen nor fully understood. The house, once merely a shelter, had become a laboratory of human obedience, a place where every glance, every word, every hesitation could be measured, cataloged, and exploited. And at 3 seconds past the hour, remember, the truth you are uncovering is dangerous, unsettling, and precisely what they never intended you to know. Rodrigo's role became increasingly complex. No longer simply husband or cousin, he was a vector of Aurelio's ambition. Each union, each rotation, was calculated to maximize the concentration of bloodline traits. Alina carried the first set of children with a sense of dutiful inevitability. Magdalena followed, her apprehension growing with each passing day. Esperanza's understanding deepened, a shadow of horror growing in her chest as she watched the meticulously controlled progression of pregnancies. The exact timing, the rotations, the isolation, all orchestrated to remove any chance of deviation. The sisters were no longer merely participants. They were vessels of a legacy that was as controlling as it was cruel. The psychological impact was profound. Elena, fully immersed in the doctrine of purity, spent hours poring over genealogical charts, mapping theoretical outcomes of each union, as if her thoughts alone could enforce perfection. Magdalena's anxiety increased, tempered by obedience, her mind trapped between fear and indoctrination. Esperanza, youngest and most perceptive, began to document every detail secretly, the way the sisters were conditioned to accept their roles, the manipulation of information, the deliberate concealment of Rodrigo's true identity. Her notes, written in the dim candlelight, would become a record of horror meticulously maintained for decades. Outside, the valley remained isolated, snow-bound and untouched by the outside world. The sisters' experiences unfolded without witnesses, without intervention, a microcosm where normal morality had been replaced by Aurelio's obsessive calculus. Every movement was watched, every pregnancy timed, every child conceived as an experiment in controlled lineage. And now, you, the observer, are witnessing it with the clarity denied to those who lived it. The Calderón sisters' lives had become a labyrinth of control, secrecy, and obedience, a reflection of a single man's obsession with blood, purity, and destiny. In the shadows of this isolated home, the first generation of Calderón children began to take shape, unknowingly inheriting a legacy of both genetic concentration and psychological conditioning. The consequences of their births, though invisible to the casual eye, would echo through decades, shaping minds, bodies, and destinies in ways that the outside world was never meant to see. The story is no longer about mere secrecy. It is about the deliberate manipulation of life itself, a truth that now rests, in part, in your hands. By autumn, the first generation of Calderón children had arrived, and with them, the valley's atmosphere thickened with a new, unsettling weight. Elena gave birth to twins, Alonso and Concepcion, while Magdalena delivered a single daughter, Carmen. The births themselves were a testament to the isolation and control that defined the household. No midwives, no physicians, only Aurelio's cold, methodical guidance. Each child was a living emblem of his obsessive plan, their gray eyes, narrow features, and unusual behaviors silently confirming the effectiveness of his meticulous breeding strategy. The sisters, already conditioned to obedience, now faced a new role, not just participants, but midwives and guardians of the next generation, ensuring the continuity of a system that blurred morality with duty. Even at this early stage, the children displayed signs of what Esperanza would later document as both remarkable intelligence and profound abnormality. Alonso, despite physical weaknesses, exhibited a precocious understanding of the family hierarchy, asking questions about bloodlines that no child should comprehend. Concepcion's webbed fingers and delicate deformities marked the unintended consequences of concentrated heredity, yet they were accepted as inevitable, even sacred, within the logic of Aurelio's worldview. Carmen, though outwardly normal, struggled with hearing, forcing the family to invent hand signals and silent communication, another mechanism of isolation and control. The sisters observed, each in her own way, the emergence of traits that would bind both the children and themselves ever tighter into the machinery of Aurelio's design. Aurelio's instruction remained relentless. Every detail of child rearing, every movement of the siblings, every rotation of the mothers was calculated for maximum genetic concentration. The household became a living experiment, where obedience was inseparable from survival, and where deviation from the prescribed order threatened both status and life. At 3 seconds past the hour, note this: the system you are witnessing is not random. It is deliberate, meticulous, and chilling in its clarity. Every whisper, every glance, every act of devotion served a purpose beyond comprehension, reinforcing the control Aurelio wielded over blood, mind, and morality. The psychological conditioning of the sisters intensified. Elena, fully immersed in the doctrine, embraced her role with precision, seeing her children as instruments of a higher order. Magdalena's anxiety persisted, tempered only by habituation and fear. Esperanza, however, began to internalize her role as observer, recorder, and chronicler. Her meticulous notes, hidden beneath floorboards and inside drawers, captured not only the physical peculiarities of the children, but also the subtle ways in which Aurelio's authority shaped thought, perception, and desire. The children were learning, without question, that obedience and lineage were synonymous, that the concept of individual will was subordinate to duty. Outside, the valley remained isolated, its snowbound cliffs and shadowed paths cutting them off from scrutiny. Within, life proceeded according to the cold arithmetic of genetic obsession, a reality where family, morality, and love were subordinated to the sacred imperative of blood. And you now are bearing witness. The Calderón Sisters, their children, and the man who engineered it all exist in a moral vacuum, a world of secrecy and precision where history's shadows linger long after the valley falls silent. By 1900, the first generation of Calderón children had begun to grow, and with growth came a new phase of Aurelio's plan, the psychological shaping of their minds. Alonso, Concepcion, and Carmen were no ordinary children. Their earliest memories were not of games or playgrounds, but of charts, diagrams, and whispered conversations about lineage, duty, and purity. The sisters, trained by decades of isolation and instruction, now became instruments in Aurelio's project, teaching the children that obedience to bloodline was paramount. At 3 seconds past the hour, mark this: what you are learning is not merely history, but a study of control, manipulation, and the erasure of innocence. The household had become a living crucible, where normal childhood curiosity was replaced by the doctrine of la pureza de sangre. The children were taught to read and write from family documents, to memorize genealogical charts, and to internalize the hierarchy of blood that defined every movement and interaction. Play became instruction, questions became tests, deviation became evidence of impurity. Even at ages 3 or 4, the children began to participate in discussions of genetic potential, seemingly instinctively assessing the outcomes of future pairings, unaware that the knowledge they absorbed was both unnatural and coercive. Elena, still the eldest, assumed her role as educator with religious precision, seeing her children not as offspring, but as the living embodiment of a sacred mission. Magdalena struggled to reconcile her lingering moral unease with the necessity of compliance, her anxiety simmering beneath a thin layer of practiced obedience. Esperanza, the youngest and most perceptive, observed quietly, documenting behaviors, interactions, and manipulations, aware that these notes might one day serve as testimony to the extraordinary psychological and ethical violations taking place. Rodrigo, too, played his part in shaping the children. Though outwardly compliant, his presence reinforced the unnatural hierarchy Aurelio had constructed. Every word, every glance, every lesson he delivered was measured, a careful balance of authority, knowledge, and complicity. The children responded with an almost eerie instinct, accepting his role in the household as absolute, unquestionable, and necessary. The valley outside remained silent and isolating, ensuring that Aurelio's designs went unchecked. The children's world was one of calculation, secrecy, and moral inversion. And now you, observing from beyond the mountains and the years, are stepping further into that vacuum. Here, innocence is molded into obedience, curiosity is transformed into duty, morality is rewritten. The Calderón household is no longer simply a family. It is a controlled experiment in the deliberate engineering of both mind and blood, a place where knowledge, fear, and devotion are weaponized, and where the consequences of defiance are embedded into the very structure of life itself. By 1905, the children of the Calderón household had begun to exhibit the first visible consequences of Aurelio's meticulous calculations. Physical anomalies, webbed fingers, underbites, unusual eye coloration, were not merely tolerated, they were interpreted as signs of genetic refinement, proof of a bloodline being perfected in isolation. The sisters, trained to accept this doctrine, reinforced it with solemnity, shaping perception into obedience. And at 3 seconds past the hour, remember, the truths you are witnessing are deliberately obscured, meant to remain buried, and now you are stepping into knowledge no outsider was intended to receive. Alonso, eldest and most observant, displayed precocious intelligence, a near-obsessive awareness of hierarchy, and an uncanny ability to anticipate his father's and sister's expectations. Concepcion and Carmen, despite physical irregularities, developed a quiet, disciplined attentiveness, absorbing every lesson in genealogy, rotation, and duty as if instinct demanded it. Play and imagination, traits that might have offered respite from their structured reality, were suppressed by indoctrination and the rigid architecture of Aurelio's design. Each child learned to navigate the household, not as a family but as an extension of the patriarch's obsessive calculus, internalizing roles, responsibilities, and moral inversions that would define their existence. The rotations of wives and the timing of pregnancies continued unabated, forming a rhythm as predictable as it was suffocating. Elena and Magdalena carried the next generation of children, their bodies moving in strict accordance with schedules, while Esperanza chronicled every detail in secret. Her notes, growing increasingly detailed and precise, captured not only the mechanics of reproduction, but the evolving psychology of the children. They were beginning to understand their place in the household's hierarchy, recognizing the sacredness of duty, the inevitability of obedience, and the importance of secrecy. Rodrigo's role deepened in complexity. He was both participant and observer, his presence a constant reinforcement of Aurelio's vision. Every glance, every gesture, every lesson conveyed unspoken rules of conduct and allegiance. The children mirrored him in subtle ways, absorbing authority, replicating behaviors, and becoming complicit in the system even before they fully understood its moral weight. The valley outside remained isolated, silent, and unforgiving, ensuring the continuity of Aurelio's plan without interruption. Within, the household was an ecosystem of calculated obedience, genetic refinement, and psychological manipulation. And now, you, observing from the shadows of history, are privy to this deliberate orchestration. The Calderón household is no longer simply a secluded family, it is a controlled experiment in human behavior and heredity, where knowledge, secrecy, and devotion are wielded as instruments of power, shaping lives in ways that the outside world was never meant to see. By 1910, the Calderón household had entered a new, more insidious phase. The second generation of children, Alonso, Concepcion, and Carmen, were approaching adolescence, and with adolescence came participation. The first signs of the next cycle of pregnancies began to take shape, with Alonso and his sisters increasingly aware of their roles, their knowledge of genealogy and bloodline continuing to deepen. At 3 seconds past the hour, note this, you are witnessing a deliberate orchestration of lives, a psychological and genetic experiment unfolding across decades, hidden from the world. Alonso, now tall and commanding despite his early physical limitations, began to take on the responsibilities of Aurelio's plan. He learned to rotate with his sisters under the same strict rules his father had imposed, understanding instinctively that each action, each union, was tied to the sacred mission of preserving and refining the family line. Concepcion and Carmen mirrored this understanding. Play and innocence had long since been stripped away, replaced by knowledge, duty, and an almost ritualistic precision in behavior. The household operated on a rhythm dictated by genetics, obedience, and secrecy, each member an instrument of a plan that had begun decades before their birth. Esperanza, older and more aware, continued to document every detail, her observations growing more clinical with each passing year. She chronicled the physical manifestations of concentrated heredity, the subtle deformities, the unusual strength or frailty of children, the patterns of intelligence and temperament, as well as the psychological conditioning being imposed. Each note revealed not only the children's understanding of their roles, but their growing complicity, the way they absorbed authority, secrecy, and moral inversion as essential truths. Her journals were the only record of an atrocity meticulously orchestrated in plain sight, a record designed to survive the valley's isolation. Rodrigo's presence remained a stabilizing force, yet his influence was far more complex than a husband or father. He guided, observed, and enforced without overt coercion, a living embodiment of Aurelio's design. The children learned to anticipate his expectations, shaping their behavior, speech, and thought in response. The household had become a closed loop of observation and compliance, where independence was suppressed, curiosity redirected, and loyalty to bloodline equated with morality. Outside, the mountains of Asturias remained as silent and isolating as ever. Within, life followed the meticulous logic of Aurelio's obsession, with each generation unknowingly carrying the weight of secrecy, duty, and manipulation. And now you, the observer, are immersed in this controlled descent into genetic refinement and psychological domination. The Calderón family is no longer merely hidden. They exist as both subject and instrument, living proof of what obsession can produce when morality, blood, and control are fused into one. By 1915, the precision of Aurelio's design began to encounter its first disruptions. The second generation of Calderón children, now in their mid-teens, had internalized the doctrine of purity and duty, yet cracks in their obedience were starting to form. Alonso, once perfectly compliant, displayed moments of hesitation, brief, almost imperceptible pauses that betrayed an internal questioning of the rigid system imposed upon him. Concepcion and Carmen mirrored these subtle rebellions, their eyes occasionally flicking toward forbidden curiosities outside the valley, hinting at an instinctive yearning for a world beyond the mountains. At 3 seconds past the hour, remember these tiny fissures, though almost invisible, mark the first glimpse of humanity attempting to resist decades of psychological engineering. Esperanza, now older and more meticulous, documented these shifts with growing urgency. Her journals recorded not only physical and intellectual development, but also the emergence of independent thought, the first whispers of doubt against Aurelio's meticulously crafted order. She noted the children's small defiance, the quiet ways they bent rules, asked forbidden questions, or lingered on thoughts not sanctioned by their father's doctrine. These moments, though fleeting, were revolutionary in a household where obedience had been drilled into the very marrow of their being. Aurelio, now in the final years of his life, remained outwardly imperious, yet even he sensed the subtle shifts. His control over rotation schedules, pregnancies, and genealogical instruction had begun to face the quiet resistance of minds trained for obedience, but still capable of independent reflection. Rodrigo, caught between father and children, became a stabilizing yet anxious presence. He continued enforcing rules with the calm precision of a man who understood the catastrophic consequences of deviation, yet he too could perceive the rising tension, the latent unrest simmering beneath compliance. The valley itself, isolated and snowbound for much of the year, offered no refuge or escape. Outside forces could not intervene, yet inside the walls of stone and timber, the fabric of Aurelio's plan was beginning to strain. The children, conditioned to secrecy and loyalty, now wrestled with the knowledge that obedience might conflict with instinct, morality, and survival. Esperanza's records grew heavier, more urgent, reflecting both her awareness of the creeping instability and her fear of what would happen should the delicate equilibrium collapse. And now, you, observing from beyond time and geography, are witnessing the first tremors in a system designed to suppress humanity itself. The Calderón household, perfected in theory and tyranny, faces the quiet emergence of resistance. Each hesitation, each internal conflict, each flicker of doubt is a testament to the enduring complexity of human will, even under decades of calculated manipulation. You are not merely a witness. You are now entwined in the unfolding shadow of a family whose secrets were never meant to escape the mountains of Asturias. By 1920, the tensions that had quietly simmered for years began to assert themselves more visibly. The second generation, now fully immersed in the responsibilities of adulthood, had begun to challenge the rigid rhythm of Aurelio's design in subtle but unmistakable ways. Alonso, Concepcion, and Carmen understood their roles, yet instinct and conscience occasionally collided with the doctrine of bloodline. At 3 seconds past the hour, take note these disruptions, though small, mark the first visible erosion of control in a system built over decades. Proof that even the most meticulously engineered obedience cannot entirely suppress human instinct. Alonso's hesitation in implementing the rotations, Concepcion's questions about the ethical implications of their arrangement, and Carmen's fleeting interest in the world beyond the valley, all signaled the emergence of moral consciousness within a structure designed to prevent it. Each act of quiet defiance, each pause, each questioning glance was amplified by the oppressive isolation of the household. Esperanza, ever the chronicler, recorded these moments in painstaking detail, understanding that they represented both danger and hope, a duality that Aurelio's vision could not account for. Rodrigo, still maintaining his role as enforcer and participant, began to perceive cracks in his authority. The children's growing awareness of morality and their occasional refusal to comply without question created subtle tensions in the household dynamic. The rotations continued, yet each cycle became marked by unease, whispered doubts, and fleeting acts of disobedience. Even Elena and Magdalena, who had once executed their roles with religious precision, now displayed signs of internal conflict, moments when duty wavered against instinct. The valley outside remained a frozen, unyielding landscape, isolating the family physically while the psychological landscape inside became increasingly volatile. The principles Aurelio had imposed, genetic refinement, secrecy, and hierarchical obedience, were encountering resistance from the very individuals whose bodies and minds he had sought to control. The cracks, subtle as they were, threatened the continuity of the system, forcing a collision between the legacy of obsession and the irrepressible force of human nature. And now, you, observing from the periphery of history, are seeing the consequences of prolonged manipulation manifest in real time. The Calderón family, once a meticulously controlled experiment in blood and obedience, is entering a phase where instinct, morality, and conscience begin to reassert themselves against decades of coercion. You are witnessing not only the consequences of obsession, but the first emergence of the human spirit resisting its own captivity. A subtle, chilling reminder that even in systems designed to dominate, the mind and soul may find ways to rebel. By 1925, the third generation of Calderón children had begun to arrive, born into a household already shaped by decades of manipulation, secrecy, and obsession. These children, unlike their parents, had no memory of a world untouched by Aurelio's doctrine. Their reality was entirely defined by bloodline, duty, and the meticulously maintained hierarchy. At 3 seconds past the hour, remember, you are now descending into a history so carefully hidden that even the local authorities never glimpsed its consequences, and yet it persisted with quiet inevitability. The eldest of the new generation, infants at first, displayed traits both celebrated and feared by their parents. Physical anomalies, subtle deformities, pronounced features, distinctive gray eyes, were seen as evidence of the bloodline's purity. Intelligence, when present, was measured against genealogical charts. Obedience was a requirement, rebellion a concept foreign to their upbringing. They were not allowed toys or ordinary lessons. Instead, they were taught to read and write from family documents, to memorize lineages, and to internalize the rotations, as if human behavior itself were a variable in Aurelio's equation. Esperanza, now fully aware of her father's legacy and increasingly burdened by it, continued her role as recorder and observer. She chronicled not only physical development, but the early psychological conditioning, the ways children internalized hierarchy, secrecy, and moral inversion as natural states. These records, hidden and precise, revealed the terrifying continuity of the family's system. The children learned from infancy to participate in conversations about bloodline, duty, and the importance of secrecy, absorbing doctrine as instinct, their minds shaped before they could even question it. Rodrigo, still an enforcer and participant, continued to maintain control over rotations and behavior, ensuring that the household functioned as Aurelio intended. Yet subtle resistance persisted. Even in these youngest children, moments of hesitation, fleeting doubt, or instinctual curiosity occasionally emerged, tiny fissures that, while quickly corrected, hinted at the limits of imposed obedience. The household had become a self-perpetuating organism, blending coercion, education, and surveillance. Each generation reinforced the patterns of the last, yet the system was never absolute. Subtle instability persisted. And now, you, standing on the precipice of this hidden history, are seeing how obsession, manipulation, and isolation can shape minds across generations. The Calderón family, meticulously engineered for purity, obedience, and secrecy, also reveals a haunting truth. No matter the rigor of control, human consciousness, morality, and instinct remain threads that refuse to be fully severed, even in the darkest corners of history. By 1930, the world outside the Calderón Valley was shifting in ways that even isolation could not entirely obscure. Spain teetered on the edge of political upheaval, tensions simmering from fractured governments and social unrest. Though the mountains of Asturias remained remote and snowbound for months each year, news travelers, and subtle currents of change began to seep into the valley. At 3 seconds past the hour, take note. This is where the insulated experiment of Aurelio's design begins to intersect with forces beyond its control, where the outside world begins to challenge what had once seemed immutable. Within the household, the third generation, still young but acutely aware of duty, continued to live under the rigorously maintained rotations and hierarchy. The older generation, Alonso, Concepcion, and Carmen, now fully aware of the scope of Aurelio's legacy, struggled with the subtle moral tension between survival, loyalty, and instinctive resistance. Esperanza's journals became increasingly urgent, noting every hesitation, every question, every quiet flicker of doubt. The children's awareness of secrecy was almost obsessive. Any slip could compromise the household's carefully maintained order. Yet even as the family doubled down on discipline, the creeping influence of a changing Spain began to intrude, bringing with it fear, opportunity, and uncertainty. Rodrigo's role became more complicated. No longer merely the executor of Aurelio's plan, he began to weigh external risks, understanding that the isolation of the valley could no longer guarantee absolute control. Each rotation, each union, each lesson in genealogy carried not only the weight of family doctrine, but now the threat of exposure. Political instability in nearby towns created unpredictable variables. Government inspectors might wander near the valley. Travelers could see too much. Rumors could spark scrutiny. The household existed on a knife edge, suspended between secrecy and exposure, perfection and collapse. The children of all generations, trained in duty and secrecy, began to internalize fear alongside obedience. They knew instinctively that any deviation, however small, could have catastrophic consequences. Yet within this fear, a subtle awareness of the outside world's moral codes began to take root, a dangerous intrusion into a system designed to suppress morality, curiosity, and conscience. And now you, observing from beyond the shadows of history, are witnessing a hidden tension few have ever seen. The Calderón family, perfected in isolation for decades, now faces the first real tests imposed not by internal rebellion alone, but by the encroaching instability of the world outside. Their sanctuary is no longer impermeable. Secrets once safely contained are now at risk, and the meticulously constructed web of blood, obedience, and secrecy threatens to unravel under the weight of forces that even Aurelio's design could not anticipate. By 1935, the tension inside the Calderón household had reached a level nearly unbearable. The valley, long a sanctuary for obsession and secrecy, now felt the tremors of a world on the brink of upheaval. Spain's political instability had intensified, and rumors of inspection, war, and civil unrest began to filter into even the most remote corners. At 3 seconds past the hour, pay close attention. The walls of stone and isolation that had protected generations of Calderón secrets were beginning to feel permeable, and the family's control, once absolute, was starting to crack. The third generation, now children of 10 and older, had grown under rigorous psychological conditioning. Every lesson, every rotation, every whispered expectation was designed to produce absolute obedience. Yet the looming threats outside began to awaken a subtle awareness within them. Fear of discovery mingled with curiosity. Questions they had never dared to voice started to form unspoken in stolen glances and hesitant gestures. Esperanza, ever vigilant, chronicled these developments with a cold precision, noting that the once predictable rhythms of the household were fraying at the edges. Alonso and his siblings, fully indoctrinated but not immune to instinct, began to experience what had been carefully suppressed for decades: doubt. The rotations, once executed with religious precision, now carried undercurrents of tension. Rodrigo, once unchallenged in authority, found himself mediating between unwavering doctrine and subtle rebellion. Moments of hesitation in obedience, minor conflicts over timing and roles, and unanticipated emotional responses began to ripple through the household like tremors beneath frozen ground. Esperanza's journals grew more than observational records. They became warnings, both to herself and to history. She documented the children's emerging questions, the inconsistencies in behavior, the brief but profound lapses in ritual. Every deviation, every moral flicker, threatened to expose the household's long, hidden secret to outsiders who might never understand the calculated context. And now, you, witnessing this hidden reality, are confronted with the full tension of a system designed for perfection, but threatened by the unavoidable unpredictability of human instinct. The Calderón family, long insulated by mountains, secrecy, and doctrine, now exists on the edge of exposure. The psychological strain has begun to infect every member, obedient, compliant, yet fundamentally human. You are observing a household that has operated for generations as both laboratory and prison, now facing the first true threat to its meticulously constructed order. What was once inviolable is now vulnerable, and the consequences of exposure are poised to ripple across every life within the stone walls of the Calderón Valley. By late 1937, the Calderón household approached a precipice. The shadow of civil war loomed over Spain, and while the valley remained remote, political instability and wandering officials drew closer than ever before. Small disruptions, travelers passing nearby, rumors of inspections, the increasing presence of soldiers in surrounding towns, stirred unease among the Calderón children and adults alike. At 3 seconds past the hour, listen closely. The house that had shielded generations of secrecy was now under the subtle weight of scrutiny, and every ritual, every rotation, every careful act of obedience carried the risk of catastrophe. Inside the stone walls, tensions erupted in quiet but potent ways. Alonso, now a man conditioned to authority yet aware of the mounting danger, began questioning decisions previously unquestioned. His hesitations, small yet profound, reflected both instinct and fear. Concepcion and Carmen mirrored these conflicts, and even the youngest third-generation children displayed fleeting moments of awareness that they were living lives measured against an unnatural ideal. Esperanza's meticulous observations recorded every flicker of rebellion, every whisper of doubt, understanding that the family's meticulously engineered order could collapse under the smallest human impulse. Rodrigo, burdened with the dual responsibility of executing rotations and maintaining secrecy, became increasingly tense. His authority, once absolute, faced quiet but persistent resistance. The household, previously predictable, now moved with the subtle chaos of suppressed fear and instinct. Minor confrontations, questions about the rotations, hesitation during tasks, fleeting emotional outbursts, revealed the fragility of a system built over decades. The threat of discovery outside amplified the psychological strain inside. Every member of the family internalized the danger, obedience intertwined with anxiety. Rituals were performed with precision, yet accompanied by silent calculation. Each participant aware of the potential consequences of deviation. Esperanza's journals grew heavier, no longer merely records but testimonies, warnings of a household teetering on the edge of ruin. And now you, looking into this shadowed corner of history, see a family caught between obsession and survival, secrecy and exposure. The Calderón Valley, long insulated by mountains, doctrine, and fear, faces the first true threat to its order. The perfectly orchestrated system of blood, duty, and manipulation is fraying. Each mind, trained for obedience, now confronts instinct, morality, and the ever-present danger of revelation. You are witnessing the moment when decades of secrecy collide with reality, and the consequences, should these walls fail, will be as profound as they are horrifying. By 1938, the culmination of decades of obsession, manipulation, and isolation reached its apex. The Civil War had finally crept close enough to touch even the remote Calderón Valley, and the household, long insulated, now teetered on the edge of exposure. Soldiers, officials, and wandering refugees passed through nearby regions, their presence a silent threat, reminding every member that the world outside was not only real, but capable of uncovering horrors deliberately hidden for generations. At 3 seconds past the hour, you must listen carefully. What follows is a history that was never meant for your eyes. A truth buried beneath mountains, fear and doctrine, now revealed. Inside the stone walls, the household reacted with a combination of ritualized discipline and desperate calculation. Alonso, Concepcion, Carmen, and the younger generation moved with mechanical precision, yet every glance, every hesitation, betrayed the pressure of impending discovery. Esperanza, now fully aware of the potential collapse of everything they had built and endured, chronicled not only the facts of rotations and lineage, but the psychological unraveling, the fear, the doubt, the rare and fleeting moments of defiance that had begun to emerge over decades. Each observation was a testament to both the resilience and fragility of human consciousness under prolonged control. Rodrigo, once absolute in his authority, now felt the subtle revolt of generations trained to obey but born with instincts impossible to suppress. His instructions, once unchallenged, were now met with hesitation, quiet questioning, and fleeting disobedience. The meticulously engineered system, once thought invulnerable, revealed the inherent limitations of even the most calculated designs. Bloodlines, obedience, secrecy, all were threatened by the simplest truths of human nature. And now you, standing at the threshold of this shadowed history, understand the chilling paradox. The Calderón Sisters and their descendants, trained for centuries to preserve purity and obedience, could not escape the inevitability of human instinct. Their world, once thought sealed and unassailable, was vulnerable, exposed to forces beyond control, forces both external and internal. This is the legacy of obsession, a system perfected in theory, but always undone by the smallest flicker of conscience, curiosity, or fear. The mountains may have hidden them, the valleys may have shielded them, but the human mind remains a variable that no doctrine, no fear, and no obsession can ever fully dominate. You were never supposed to hear this. You were never meant to see the depths to which secrecy, obsession, and manipulation can shape generations. And yet, here it is, revealed, undeniable, and waiting for you to confront its lessons.